Hey, you're not actually registered.
I'm sorry?
You're not registered for the class, are you?
Finance.
Didn't say your name on the roll.
Dr. Ford, can you just buy our calculator for today?
Yep.
Thanks.
Nope. Okay. So you are now. You weren't. All right. I've got 8:01, so it's time to get started.
Whoa. Okay.
All right.
Sorry, Dr. Ford, the door, they wouldn't let us in before 8 o'clock.
Yeah, this is a big event.
So I sent a copy of the syllabus out, obviously, last week. Hopefully you've gotten a copy of it. If you haven't, you can obviously go on Blackboard and obtain it. It's pretty straightforward in terms of what we're going to be doing in this class, obviously focusing on the lender's perspective as it relates to real estate finance. The format of the course, starting with today, is we're going to be focusing on using the financial calculator, specifically the HP 10B. Everybody bring one?
Yep.
Good. What we're going to do is kind of work through a bunch of sample problems today, focusing on the use of the calculator and exclusively the use of the calculator. Then for those of you that are enrolled in the financial modeling classes this afternoon, we'll be focusing on Excel. Okay, so the difference between basically what we're doing in the morning is focused exclusively on the use of the calculator. What we're doing in the afternoon is exclusively focused on using Microsoft Excel. All right, so the way the course is structured, the first week, as I said, today is really focused on using the financial calculator. Subsequent weeks will be focused on different topical areas, and if you sort of take a look at the syllabus, the way that it's structured, there are a number of quizzes and a number of tests. Now, the way the quizzes work is after we have covered the material for the day, then we give a quiz, okay? And then you've typically got, I don't know, 30 or so minutes to work on the quiz. And then after you complete the quiz, I grade the quiz, so you immediately see how you did for that particular day, that particular quiz. All right? Now, if you take a look specifically at how the grades are calculated, they are based on the quiz scores and test scores, or the test scores. So in essence, quiz number 1, quiz number 2, quiz number 3 basically comprise test number 1. Now, if you are satisfied with your grades on quiz 1, quiz 2, and quiz 3, you do not have to take test 1. Does that make sense? Okay? Now, once again, the quizzes, and the difference between the quiz and the test is as follows. The quiz is administered immediately after we have covered the material for that day, and it is open book, open notes, and obviously being able to use the calculator. So the idea behind the quizzes is that if you've paid attention, you followed along, you're good to go, you're going to do well on the quiz, and then you don't have to take the test, okay? If you don't do well on the quizzes, then you take the test. The test is closed book, closed notes, okay? So the incentive is obviously to pay attention the day of the quiz, the day of the material, do well on the quizzes, and then you don't have to worry about actually studying for the test. Does that make sense? Okay, now, if you look at the actual, once again, grades, or how the grades are calculated, in essence, you've got quiz 1, quiz 2, quiz 3, and okay, quiz 1, quiz 2, quiz 3, and if you are satisfied with those, then that is your grade that takes care of test number 1. Same sort of thing applies to test number 2. Quiz 4, 5, and 6 comprise test 2, Quizzes 7, 8, and 9 comprise basically test 3. So that's 90% of your grade right there from either the quizzes or the test. Does that make sense? The remaining 10% we will be dealing with at the very end of the semester, which is going to be an individual project that you will present to the other folks in the class on the last day of class. Like I said, we're not going to even talk about that until we're probably 6 or 7 weeks into the semester, okay? Because it doesn't really make any sense to bring it up right now, okay? Any questions? Okay, once again, those of you that came in late, do you have a calculator? Yep.
I have.
Okay, good. Okay, in that case, let's get started. All right, let me find out who is here. All right, so Donald is here.
Professor?
Carlos is here. Yep.
Diego, his car died, but he's taking a Lyft or Uber.
Okay. Gordo is here. Martin's here. Silva's here.
RJ.
Ping's here. Okay, Mariel's here.
I put in my request. Did you get an answer?
Do you need all the Joe logos?
Huh?
Do you need the person Joe logos?
Well, I don't know who it is.
And who else?
You know who it is?
But you know how the project was supposed to
5, 6, 7, 8.
You have to submit the request before it comes over 60.
Yeah, I
And
did.
then you'll make him or her on the Joe.
Okay.
I didn't know that.
So we still
I
got
put in my
about 8
request, but I
people
didn't
on.
tell. Do you know who yours
So what we
is?
may actually
No,
do
I
is we may
was
change the room
yeah.
next week and just go back to the
It allows you to have a
business
chance to do
building
it.
because, yeah, I'm not really a fan of this already in terms of, we can only get one of the screens to work and this business about not letting people in until 8 o'clock is just not going to work for me. Okay, yep.
We had some questions about the mentor thing, because we didn't, I mean, is it too late still, or?
We will deal with non-class related issues outside of class. Okay? All right. So, for this course, let's sort of start off with using the financial calculator and kind of, we're going to work through the basics of how to use the financial calculator and kind of work through a number of problems. So let's just sort of start off with kind of one of the most basic concepts that I tend to refer to as IRV. Okay? Now, IRV is the most fundamental, basic model of kind of understanding the value of virtually anything, but specifically understanding the value of commercial real estate. And what this is a simple little formula that relates to the income from a property, the cap rate or rate of return, and the value. Okay, how many of you have seen this before? Anybody? Okay, handful of you. All right, now, the income number is typically going to be annual net operating income. Okay. The rate, we're either going to call it the cap rate or rate of return. And the value, typically here, we're referring to investment value. All right? Now, the simple thing to sort of keep into perspective here is what is it that gives commercial real estate ultimately its value? It's the income that produces, okay? You know, if you think about it, if a property is not generating income, what real value does it have? I mean, yeah, you could say, all right, you know, sure, there's strict, you know, sticks and bricks and, you know, that you may be able to use the property for some sort of use, but at the end of the day, to an investor, if it's not generating income, it really doesn't have value, okay? And so the more income that it produces, in essence, the more value it has, okay? It's a very simple concept. So if we put some numbers in here, just to kind of put things into perspective. So let's just assume the property generates $10,000 a year in annual net operating income. And we're going to talk about what net operating income is here in a minute. But right now, just focus on it as an annual income number associated with the property, okay, that it's throwing off each year. And let's say that we have a 10% cap rate or rate of return, then with those two pieces of information, okay, then we can say the value of this property, the investment value of this property, is going to be $100,000. Okay? Now, how do we sort of get there mathematically? It's pretty simple. If I could reach that high, I would put my hand over basically the value, and then it would be income divided by rate. So 10,000 divided by 10% is going to give us 100,000. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, if all of a sudden market conditions change and cap rates change, which they do over time. I mean, what is a cap rate? A cap rate, I mean, is short for capitalization rate, which in essence is what is the rate of return on a particular property type have to be in order to attract capital to it, or in other words, to attract investment, okay? And so over time, cap rates change. They go up, they go down. But how are they sort of established? Well, to a certain extent, it's based upon the risk perception of investors. And it changes not only over time, but over a specific market and over different property types. So as an example, if you look right now into the commercial market and you look at the different property types, probably the lowest cap rates you're going to find right now are probably going to be on apartments and probably on industrial property, okay? Because those are in exceedingly high demand right now, okay? And everyone is sort of chasing those sort of deals. Whereas if you were to look at office buildings, shopping centers, and other sort of properties, you're going to see much higher cap rates, okay? And part of the rationale is that you've got to basically be generating a higher overall rate of return, overall higher rate of return for those particular properties because there's a perception that they're more risky than, let's say, apartments or industrial properties. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, that having been said, one of the things that we typically look at whenever we're trying to view a particular property is where do we get that income number from? Okay, that net operating income. Now, you've heard about net operating income, but where does it actually come from? All right. So one of the things that you're going to need to become familiar with is a basic sort of income statement from a commercial property. And the one that I typically use starts off with potential gross income. We're going to talk about each of these. We subtract out vacancies and collection losses. We add in other income. That's going to give us effective gross income. We subtract out total operating expenses. That gives us net operating income. Okay, does that look familiar to some of you? Okay, others of you, maybe you've never seen it before. Okay, so let's go through and explain each line item. All right, starting off with potential gross income, PGI. Whenever you have a commercial property, you're typically going to have a lease rate associated with that property either on a per unit basis or on a per square foot basis. So let's just say that we have a property that has, I don't know, 5,000 square feet of space. Okay, so maybe a small little shopping center. All right, 5,000 square feet of space. And for that 5,000 square feet of space, let's say $20 per square foot per year is the rental rate, okay? So what we're going to be doing is taking the 5,000 times the $20 per square foot per year, and in this case, that's going to give us $100,000 of potential gross income. Does that make sense, everybody? Now, this number is not related to what I drew up on the ERV model, so don't try to draw a connection there. Okay, so 100,000 is going to be your annual potential gross income off of this property. Does that make sense? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Now, from that, we have to adjust that income. That's the maximum income that it's going to derive from rental income, okay? So from that, we're going to have to subtract out vacancies and collection losses, okay, VCL. What is the difference between a vacancy and a collection loss? A vacancy is where you don't have a tenant and they're not paying rent, okay? That's a vacancy. That's pretty straightforward. But that's different from a collection loss. A collection loss is where you do have a tenant, but they're not paying rent, okay? And you want to make sure that there's a distinction there, and we're going to talk about some issues related to that in terms of valuation later. But right now, just make sure that you understand that distinction. So in this particular case, let's say for this property, we have a 15% vacancy and collection loss, all right? So under those circumstances, all we're going to do is multiply the $100,000 times the 15%. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, which is going to give us a vacancy and collection loss of $15,000. Okay, everybody with me? All right, now, then we have a line for other income. All right, an example of other income is basically any non-rental related income. So if you're talking about, let's say, an apartment community, this could be things like washer and dryers, you know, that they maybe have coin-operated washer and dryers. Could also be fees that they charge for parking, okay? You know, where they've got garages on site or carports or whatever it might be, and they charge you a fee for that, okay? It could also be, you know, for office buildings. You know, it could be a situation of maybe where on the outside of the office building they've got a billboard, okay, that somebody pays them to have some signage on the outside of their building. It could also be, you know, from other ancillary services that they may provide to their tenants, okay? But the point being is, the distinction here is it's non-rental income, okay? So it's not tied to the actual rental of the primary real estate. Okay, it's some other source of income. So for this particular property, we're going to assume they don't have any additional other income. All right? So we simply do the math, and that's going to leave us with $85,000 as our effective gross income. So effective gross income is just simply how much real hard cash currency do we have that comes in and is sitting in our bank, or, you know, that we have access to. Does that make sense? Okay. Operating expenses, total operating expenses. Now, and we're going to get into this a little bit deeper later, but right now, superficially, depending on the type of lease that we have with a property, we as the owner of the property may or may not have any operating expenses, okay? For example, let's kind of, I'll do the quick little extreme. We can have a triple net lease on one end of the spectrum, and we can have a gross lease on the other end of the spectrum, okay? These are leases. Under a triple net, an absolute, I'm going to actually go so far as to calling it an absolute triple net lease. This is where the tenant pays for every single possible imaginable expense with the property. If a window gets broken out, it's the tenant's responsibility. If the parking lot needs to be repaved, it's the tenant's responsibility. If the roof needs to be replaced, it's the tenant's responsibility. Anything that happens with that property, it's the tenant's responsibility. Okay, does that make sense?
Just because my accountant brain. So operating expenses, because non-operating expenses typically aren't passed through. So
I understand.
I don't know.
We're gonna deal with that here in a minute. Yep.
What was that term called again?
The type of lease is an absolute triple net.
Okay.
And the idea behind the absolute triple net is this is where you have an investor that simply wants to collect a check every month. They don't want to ever be bothered with anything, ever. You know, so they're never going to get a phone call from the tenant. It's a sort of relationship. You send a check to a lockbox, they pick it up, they cash it, that's it. Does that make sense? Okay, on the other end of the extreme are gross leases. And that, in essence, from the tenant's perspective, is kind of like it's an all bills paid sort of lease. So this is like, to a certain extent, you know, if you've ever lived in like a dorm, in many cases, you know, they're not going to charge you for the electricity, you know, in addition to what you're already paying. You know, they're not going to charge you basically for, you know, water and sewer, because that's already included. In other words, all of the expenses are included within the base lease rate. Does that make sense? Okay, so those are the two complete polar opposites. Now, in practice, most leases tend to fall somewhere between those two, okay? But I'm just trying to sort of illustrate the extremes here for the moment, just to illustrate the concept. Now, having just said that, if we have a situation of where you have a tenant that is, in essence, under a absolute triple net, then we really don't have any operating expenses from the investor's perspective. Now, yes, from an accounting perspective, they're going to be probably reimbursable expenses, and I get that. But in terms of the actual net expense for the owner, it may very well be, under an absolute triple net, operating expenses would be zero. Does that make sense? Okay? Meaning that their net operating income is going to be $85,000. All right? So now, if we go back up to our model and we plug in 85,000 as our new income number, and we keep our cap rate at 10%, then in essence, our value for the property is going to be $850,000. Does everybody see that? On a very basic rudimentary level.
Net operating, yeah.
Okay? Now, the part that you should be thinking about, and this is where the development piece sort of comes in, and also sort of the financing piece, is, and the reason why I make it so ridiculously basic and simple is that you can begin to see something of real value here. And that is what I'm going to refer to as incremental value or value creation, okay? And what I mean by that is anything that you can do as the owner, investor, developer of the property to increase this number, that has an immediate flow-through effect on the overall value of the property. Does that make sense? Okay? So for every dollar, let's just think about this for a second. If our cap rate is 10%, for every additional dollar of net operating income, how much additional value does that create for the property? 10 extra dollars. Does that make sense? In other words, if we were to just put $1 up here for net operating income, and we have the 10% as our cap rate, 1 divided by 10% is going to be 10. So 10 extra marginal dollars are created for that property. This is why, you know, as an owner, operator, investor, developer, you are so ridiculously concerned about what is that net operating income number, because that is ultimately going to drive the value of your project. So what do you want to do as the owner, investor, developer? Number one, you want to get the highest rental rate you can possibly get for the project. Yes? That seems obvious, but that's number one. Number two, you want to minimize every vacancy and collection loss, okay? Number three, you potentially want to maximize every possible other income source you can imagine to basically create additional value for the property. And then whenever it comes to operating expenses, you want to push as many of those to the tenant as possible so that you create less uncertainty as to what your income stream is. Does that make sense? Okay? So all of that, ultimately, as I said, translates down to this net operating income number that we then apply the cap rate to, and we get a value. Now, and this is before we ever really get the lender involved. This is just simply trying to understand where's the money coming from, how does it flow through, how does it impact value? Does that make sense? Are we good? Okay, now, if you understand that piece, then let's say we transport this now to the lender, okay? What is the lender going to be concerned about? What are they going to be looking at, you know? And there are going to be a couple of different criteria that the lender is automatically going to be placing on you. The chances are, if you hop online right now and you start Googling different types of commercial loans, what you're going to find is that usually there's a set criteria that each lender is going to have depending on different property types, depending on geographic locations, and so forth, so on. They're going to say, we specialize in multifamily loans in the southeast part of the country, and we require a debt service coverage ratio of, let's say, 1.3, and we have a maximum loan to value ratio of, let's say, 80%, okay? Those two pieces of information are absolutely mission critical for understanding the lender and what they're going to ultimately be willing to do in terms of lending to you on a project. Not every, let me put it this way, every lender is different. Think of lenders as retailers. Whenever you go shopping for a product, typically, you know, now you hop online, you look around, you see who potentially has the best deal. Yes? Okay? Same sort of thing should be true with lenders because they're no different. Every lender has a different set of sort of costs, okay, or a different sort of deal structure that they're willing to offer you. And what you're going to be able to do at the end of this course is be able to sift through a lot of that information and really be able to determine which deal is the best deal. Because inherently, the first thing the person off of the street thinks whenever they're searching for a lender is, okay, who has the lowest interest rate? Wrong. That's not the first thing you inherently, I mean, that's one thing to look at, but the stated interest rate doesn't tell the whole story. Doesn't talk at all about their loan origination fees, doesn't talk about prepayment penalties, doesn't talk about administrative charges they may inflict upon you, doesn't talk about the issues, what if I want to potentially prepay the loan early? Am I going to even be allowed to prepay it early? You know, those are the kinds of things that are much more important because, you know, what happens if you all of a sudden make a loan with somebody and 3 years later you're seeing a market change in the property value and you're saying, I want to sell it now before the market goes down, you may be precluded from doing so by your lender. You're saying, are you telling me I can't pay my loan back? Yeah, that's what I'm telling you. Because you are locked into a contract. This is not residential finance, okay? There's a big difference. In commercial real estate finance, it's much more of buyer beware, okay? In the sense that the automatic assumption with commercial loans is that you're an intelligent sort of player in the market. With residential loans, there's all sorts of government protections out there to keep you from doing something stupid, okay? With commercial loans, that's not the case, okay? So that's something that you need to keep kind of in the back of your mind. Okay, so let's sort of continue and sort of work through what I'm talking about with respect to lenders, all right? So the next couple of line items on this basic income statement are going to be annual debt service, which is obviously going to be your principal and interest payment to the lender, followed by, and this is pretty much where we're going to be stopping for this course. We'll be picking it up in the investments course, but in this course we only get down to the before tax cash flow, okay? Which is basically what is the income that we have generated after we've paid all of our bills, including our mortgage payment, Okay, does that make sense? So, once again, annual debt service before tax cash flow, okay? Now, as I mentioned, okay, as I mentioned, there were a couple of different terms I threw out. Debt service coverage ratio. And the other term was loan to value ratio. Okay? Now, chances are, once again, you may have heard of these terms before, okay? The debt service coverage, yeah.
Covered.
Debt service coverage ratio, DSCR, sometimes abbreviated just to debt coverage ratio, DCR, is simply taking a look at your net operating income divided by your annual debt service. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. Your loan to value ratio is going to be what is the market value of the property as the denominator, and then the numerator is going to be the loan amount. Okay? All right. These are the two probably most important, fundamental, basic ratios as it relates to real estate finance and going to a lender and obtaining a commercial real estate loan, is understanding these two ratios, how they work, and ultimately what it really means, okay? So let's just say, and I think I mentioned a while ago, that you may have a lender and they said that their debt service coverage ratio was a 1.3. And I said a loan to value ratio of, let's say, 80%. All right, so let's just sort of take those and kind of work with those numbers for a second. 1.3, net operating income divided by annual debt service. So let's take a look here for a second. All right. We have, on this particular property, if we continue on with this example, we have net operating income of $85,000. Okay? So let's go back. Okay? And if we put in $85,000 as our net operating income, and we know that our maximum debt service coverage ratio can be 1.3, then what we're left to solve for is what? Our annual debt service. Okay? So, doing that math, 85,000 divided by 1.3 is going to give us a maximum annual debt service of $65,384.62 rounded. Okay? Did you right see that?
The 1.3 is the ABS, right?
The,
No,
the 1.3 is the debt service coverage ratio. Okay? So once again, all we're doing is taking the 85,000, dividing it by what the lender has told us their maximum debt service coverage ratio or minimum debt service coverage ratio is of 1.3, and that tells us our maximum annual debt service of $65,384.62. Okay? Everybody cool with that? Okay? Now, if we go back, okay, and we put that number in here, 65,000, I'm gonna round it off to 385. Okay, so 85,000 minus 65,385, $19,615. Okay, everybody good with that? All right, so let's talk about that number for just a second. Start thinking like a lender, all right? What the lender is going to do whenever they receive basically this information from you down to net operating income, they're going to be challenging every one of your assumptions, okay? Instantly. They're going to say, are your rent rates realistic? Are they too high? You know, chances are, as a developer investor, you're never going to give them too low of a rate. More than likely, you're going to give them too high of a rate, but they're going to haircut it. You know, they're going to take a look at it and they're going to say, this is way too high, or this is just right, or whatever. They're going to pull their own market comps with respect to what they believe the rental rates should be for that property. Now, they're still going to maybe have a discussion with you and that sort of thing, allow you to potentially justify, you know, your rental rates. But, you know, they're not usually going to just blindly accept, you know, that you're telling them it's 20 bucks a square foot without them going and doing their own due diligence to try to figure out, you know, if that's a legitimate number, okay? But let's assume that they agree with you on that. Same sort of thing is going to be true with vacancy and collection losses, okay? They're going to say, is that a realistic number for this particular product type, for this particular market? Do we need to adjust it, you know, in any way? And they'll do that. Also, on the other income, and this is one where it gets a little bit tricky sometimes with lenders, because a lot of times lenders tend to kind of look at that other income line as kind of more like a bonus, okay? And what I mean by that is in many cases they almost completely discount it, okay? Because their perspective is that's not really core income, okay? That is associated with other ancillary sort of things, and we don't want to get into a situation of where we're lending potentially on ancillary items that aren't necessarily core real estate. So that one is a little bit tricky at times, okay? And then we come down to operating expenses. Once again, they're going to take a look at who is actually paying the bill, but more specifically, they're also going to be concerned here as who your tenants are, or who your prospective tenants are, and what the credit ratings of those tenants are. And this is one fundamental difference from old school lending versus new school lending. Old school lending, you based pretty much the entire commercial loan off of the full faith and credit of the borrower, okay? The borrower being the investor, developer, whoever. That was kind of the old school model. And to some extent, still is used in some markets. The new school model is to basically say, we don't really care about who the investor is, who the developer is. What we care about is who the tenants are. Because the tenants, at the end of the day, are the ones actually paying the rent. And so if you've got really high quality tenants that are signed up and committed to the space, especially for long-term leases, they're willing to do that loan based on the credit worthiness of those tenants. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, all right, so we move on down, and let's say they do agree with you on this NOI of $85,000, all right? So their perspective at this point is, all right, at the end of the day, at the end of the year, supposedly, you're gonna have $85,000 sitting in your bank account, yes? Yeah. Okay? So the lender is basically saying, okay, with that $85,000, how certain am I that that $85,000 is going to be there, okay? And so if they're really certain, they're going to say, well, our debt coverage ratio requirement is going to be 1, which would mean that they would lend you enough to where your annual debt service would be $85,000. Does that make sense? But they're never that certain. Never are they ever that certain of that income. Therefore, they always want to have a cushion, okay, above and beyond what income that you say you're going to have to make sure that, number one, they get paid. That is their overriding objective as the lender, that they get paid back. And that there are no excuses, no issues, no problems, they're going to get paid back. So, with that 1.3 debt coverage ratio or debt service coverage ratio, what they're basically saying is we're building in a 30% cushion here. That we're really only saying, if you sort of think of it, they're basically saying this represents kind of the 30% cushion, this $19,000. Does that make sense? So we're really only saying that you've got to generate about 70% of what you say you're going to basically generate. Does that make sense? So what this means at the end of the day is, yeah, your income could go down by $19,615 and you would still be able to do what? Pay the lender. Okay, does that make sense? Because there's no doubt that over the course of the year, there are going to be unexpected expenses. It just happens, okay? They're going to be, there's going to be damage that you're going to potentially have to repair. There's going to be, something's going to go wrong. You're going to have a contingency for that. And the lender is just trying to be proactive with that, okay? So that's the reason for using the debt service coverage ratio. Now, having just said that, that number will vary depending on the product type, depending on the conditions of the market, and potentially who the tenants are, that sort of thing. Probably the best debt service coverage ratio I have ever seen ever is like a 1.1. Okay, where it's like a 10% sort of cushion, and that was only on super perfecto class A, could not get any better sort of situation. Yeah.
Is there like a checklist to determine who is a good tenant?
It's really going to be based on their credit score or their credit rating, and it could be something that you're going to be pulling from like Dun & Bradstreet, or you're going to have to get some sort of a record of their long-term viability. Okay. And whether or not, and their operating history as to have they ever defaulted, on a lease, where are their leases, how many different stores do they have, yada, yada, yada. Yep.
Wouldn't type of business also be
absolutely.
like if it's supermarket, he's not going anywhere, but if it's like, for example, a laundry place,
it varies.
goes down.
Absolutely, it varies. But my point is that under the absolute best of circumstances, you're probably never, ever going to see the debt coverage ratio go below a 1.1. The normal, the new normal, it used to be the normal was like 1.2, 1.25, then it sort of migrated up to like 1.3, and then now there are still a lot of deals at 1.4, 1.5. So you think about that, 1.5. Let's go to that for an example. So if you were to take the 85,000, divide that by a debt service coverage ratio of 1.5, $56,667, okay, instead of this. Now, the thing that you should be also saying, I'm just going to kind of put this one over here on purpose. Once again, we're subtracting this out. So it gives us $28,333. So with the 1.5 debt service coverage ratio, the lender is basically saying, we view this to be more risky, therefore we want a much bigger cushion. Does that make sense? Whereas this one is based on a 1.3. Okay? Now, here's the thing. You as the owner of this property, it's not like the lender is taking more money away from you. In essence, you've got more money left over. However, they're giving you a much lower loan, which means then you've got to find typically alternative sources of capital, okay? And this is where mezzanine financing, other sort of venture capital, other sort of partnerships, syndications, whatever other deal structures that you may be able to locate are going to come into play. Does that make sense? All right? Or you're just going to come up with more cash out of your own back pocket, okay? Whichever way you want to sort of look at this. All right? But let's just take this number for perspective, okay? We're saying this is the annual debt service. So, what are the variables that, in essence, are going to comprise this? Well, we know what that number is, what it represents. It's the principal and the interest payment on the loan, on the mortgage. Yes? Everybody understands that. But we don't know what the loan amount is. We don't know what the interest rate on the loan is. We don't know what the term of the loan is yet, okay? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna back into that, okay? And once again, we're gonna get into kind of, once again, using the financial calculator to kind of come up with this, but I'm gonna give you the framework for all of this first. So, let's take the 65,000. Let's get a new page here. All right. So let's take that number, 65,000, what was it?
384.
385.
385. Okay, let's just take that number for a second. That represents annual debt service. So let's convert that to monthly. Okay, so taking that, converting it to monthly, divided by 12. So 5,400, I'm going to round it off again. This is going to be our monthly debt service, 5,449. Okay, everybody cool with that? So in other words, just to put it in very simple, terms, that's our monthly payment on the loan. Our maximum monthly payment on the loan. Everybody with me? Okay, so like if you were getting a car loan, you were getting a home loan, this is your monthly payment. Okay, which is comprised of, once again, principal and interest. Okay? Now, let's take that number, let's play around with it a little bit. All right? Somebody throw out, what's the lowest interest rate that you would think might be available?
5.
Okay?
For commercial?
Yeah, I'm just
5. 5 is
5. Okay. 5%, and what might be the highest?
Hard loan or regular
Sure,
loan?
let's go, we'll go 12. That's fine.
8,
Okay.
7.
So high, low, 5%, 12%, okay? Then we also have to consider the term of the loan. In other words, how many years, okay? So what's the longest term for a commercial loan that we might be able to get?
30.
Now let me back up, okay? And this is a teaching moment. There is a difference between a loan amortization period versus a loan term, okay? The term is how many years do you get the loan for? The loan amortization period is over how many years are the payments based, okay? Let me explain that. Most commercial loans tend to be 5-year terms that are renewable, okay? But they may have 20 or 30-year amortization periods, meaning that the actual payment that you're going to calculate is going to be a payment as if it were a 30-year loan. Does that make sense? But yet, you're going to have to pay off the loan or refinance the loan after 5 years. Does that make sense? The difference. Okay? Now, so with this particular case, we're going to make the assumption that we're going to potentially take a look at 10-year loans, maybe 15 years, let's go to, 30. Okay? So these are going to be some of our base assumptions here and kind of tinker around with them a little bit. All right. So this is the first thing we're going to do on the calculator. And we're going to run through some stuff now, but I'm going to come back and explain it a little bit later. Okay? So right now, just kind of hang on for the ride. All right? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make the assumption that, once again, this is a monthly loan. Okay, which means monthly compounding. All this will make sense a little bit later. So for the calculator, the steps are going to be something like this. 12, you're going to hit the shift key, and then you're going to hit payments per year. Okay? That's on the top row of your calculator underneath the payment key. All right? What that's going to do to the calculator is that's going to tell it it is a monthly loan, 12 payments per year, and so get ready for that information. All right? Then, the piece of information we do know is that our loan amount, or our payment amount is $5,449. That is going to be the monthly payment amount. All right? That is going to be, whoops. That is going to be a negative cash outflow to us, okay? In terms of if we're making a payment to the bank, that is going to be a negative number to us. So we're going to change the sign using the plus minus key, which is on the upper kind of left-hand side of the calculator, the fourth key down as plus minus, okay? And then we're going to hit the payment key. All right? Now begins the other pieces of information that we can kind of choose from. All right? Interest rate, 5%. So we're going to put in 5% as our interest rate, the interest rate key, top second key of the calculator. All right? And then for our first term, we're going to put in 10 years. So 10, shift in, and then we're going to simply solve for the loan amount or the present value. Now, if you're completely lost, that is okay. We're going to come back to it, okay? Right now, just hang on for the ride, okay? All right, so we do this. All right, so let's see what we get. 5,449 plus or minus payment, 5 interest rate, 10 years, 120 payments. So this is telling us our maximum loan based on this particular criteria is going to be $539,739 and let's say 8 cents. Okay? Does that make sense conceptually? Okay? So what we can now do is then we can begin to use the calculator to say, well, what if we change this interest rate to something else? What if we change this term to something else? We're going to be keeping constant the payment. Everybody follow that? Because the payment, the lender has already set, that's the maximum amount that they're going to allow you to spend each year on your payment. So really, the two variables, if you will, are the interest rate and the term, okay? Now, think about this. This is where I want you to just use your brain, ignore the calculator, ignore the math, with the exception of this. If your interest rate goes up, what does that mean? Like, for example, if I've borrowed a big pile of money and my interest rate goes up, what does my payment do? It goes up as well, yes? Okay? Let's say I, once again, borrow a big pile of money, and my term is, let's say, 5 years, but now all of a sudden I'm able to increase my term to 30 years. Payment goes down, yes? Okay? Understanding that very basic logic is sort of critical here, and this is what I'm kind of wanting you to think about. So now in this circumstance, we're kind of looking at it from a flipped view. We're sort of saying we have a fixed payment. But as we modify the interest rate and as we modify the term, what is that going to do to the amount that we're going to be able to borrow? Okay? So just think through the logic, okay? Don't focus on the math, think through the logic, okay? If our payment stays constant and we start raising the interest rate, that is going to do what to our loan amount? All our things held constant. It's going to cause it to go down. In other words, we're going to be able to borrow less money as our interest rate goes up. Okay? Because once again, we're keeping our payment constant. Okay? Now, on the term, if we increase our term, that is going to do what?
Decrease the payment.
Well, it's going to decrease the payment, but more specifically, it's going to allow us to borrow more money. Okay? Because our payment is fixed. Okay? So the best possible scenario that we could have is doing what? Lowering our interest rate and raising our term. That's going to maximize the amount we can borrow. Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay? So let's just see kind of what the resulting impact would be. Okay, so what we're saying, and I can kind of maybe do it this way. So for a 10-year loan, 15, 30-year, scratch them out down here, and we'll say, okay, right here, 513,739 is the amount we can borrow. Okay? Everybody see that? All right. So now, if I want to make a change, and specifically, we want to go with the term being increased to, let's say, 15 years, we don't have to redo the whole problem. The beauty of the calculator is we're able to simply put in what is the new term, replacing the old one, and then now resolve for the maximum loan amount. $689,054, okay, and 055 rounded, okay. So in this case, 689,055. So we've increased our purchasing power, if you will, or the amount of loan that we can obtain on this property from 513,000 to 689,000 just by changing the term from 10 years to 15 years. Does everybody see that? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if we change it to 30 years, okay, so once again, kind of 30 shift in, resolve for the present value.
No, you don't want to. $1,015,049. Yes? Okay.
Those of you that are able to follow along. Okay? So that's a pretty big jump. So going from 10 years to 30 years, you know, pretty much doubling the size of the loan that we could obtain from the lender. Okay, so now, just, once again, very, very simple, teachable moment. What do you think most borrowers tend to want to do? Get 30-year loans or 30-year amortization periods because it's going to maximize.
Debt profit too.
Well, it's going to maximize their ability to keep their payment low, but more specifically to maximize a loan amount they're able to obtain. Okay? Now let's go to the 12% here for a second. And what we can do on the 12%, we simply put that in here, resolve for present value. Now, in doing so, what this is going to do is it's going to replace the 5%, but it's still going to be based on the 30 years. Okay? So, let's see what it tells us. Wow. That drops it down to 529,743. Okay?
So basically, if you double the interest rate, it goes down by half.
Yep. So now we go and we change, get to 15. $454, 419, let's say. And then finally, down to 10 years. $379,798. Okay, so this is just illustrating what we were just talking about. The worst case scenario in terms of the dollar amount we can borrow is to have the highest interest rate with the lowest term. The best case scenario, being able to borrow the most, is going to be with the lowest interest rate and the longest term. Okay? It's pretty simple in the sense of just once you kind of begin to wrap your head around it. But I mean, anytime that you're thinking about borrowing, that's what you're going to want to try to shoot for. Is what is the lowest interest rate? What is the longest term? okay? That's one of the first things to shoot for, okay? Is everybody just clear, not necessarily with using the calculator, we're gonna get into that a little bit later. Right now, this is just simply, you understand the logic, yes? Okay, all right. So, and we kind of have the choice here, if the lender allows us, so which one are we gonna go for? We're probably gonna go for the 5% for 30 years, yes?
Right.
Okay. So, 1015, 049. All right, let's get that. All right. Okay, so our maximum loan amount, we're saying is 1015,049. Now, is that necessarily that number? I just want you to think about this for a second. Is that number necessarily the indicative of the market value of the property? Not necessarily. This is all about the financing of the property, okay? This is not about the actual market valuation of the property. This is simply, in essence, this is the maximum loan amount you could get based upon the lender criteria, okay? So what if we did a market valuation of the property and an appraiser comes back and the appraiser says market value is equal to $1,500,000. Okay? Is that a good thing, bad thing? What do you think?
Good thing.
Okay, it's a good thing, all right? It's worth more than what the maximum loan amount is, so that's a good thing. But yet, I said that the lender has a second criteria that typically they use when evaluating loans, the loan-to-value ratio, okay? So once an appraiser has done their job, gives that value estimate back to the lender, then the lender says, okay, we have an internal maximum loan-to-value ratio of, let's say, 80%. Okay, so let's multiply that out. And that gets us down to, 1.2 million. Okay, so this is in one sense it's a great thing, in one sense it may not be. The maximum.
Why did you do 0.80?
Okay.
80% loan to value. Okay.
Loan to value ratio is 80% maximum. Okay, so the lender is basically saying, under the best of circumstances, we're willing to lend you 1.2 million on this property. Okay? Now, here's the thing that you've got to make sure that you understand. There is a lot of times a disconnect between what the appraiser says it's worth and what you think it's worth and what the lender thinks it's worth. Okay? Everybody follow that?
Yeah.
Okay? So the appraiser has said, okay, it's worth 1.5 million. But the lender's saying we're only going to lend potentially up to 1.2 million. But based upon the other criteria that the lender set, the debt service coverage ratio, the maximum that we were able to get in terms of a loan amount from the lender was 1,015,049. Does that make sense? Yes or no? So, what does that mean we're going to have to do? You're basically going to have to take that 1.2 million, subtract out the maximum that they'll actually give you under the conditions that we've got. $184,951. Okay. So what does that number represent?
You needing cash?
Excess money?
excess money that you need or additional equity that you're gonna need to contribute into the project. Because you're already contributing how much equity?
1.5.
No,
Or 20%,
No.
yeah.
well, 20%, yes. You're contributing 300,000, yes?
Yeah.
The difference between 1.5 and 1.2 is 300,000, okay? So that's your baseline equity. This is the additional equity that you've got to come up with. So you're gonna have to come up with basically 484,951, okay? Does that make sense? So,
Are you using appraisals valuation as a sales price?
yes. And I'm using that interchangeably because in this particular case, we're sort of making the assumption that, yeah, it's what it potentially sold for or what it would sell for based upon other properties within the area. Okay? So total equity would be the 484,951. Now, the question is, which goes beyond the scope of this class and gets into the investments class, where do we get that equity from? Okay? Well, on the most simplistic basis, we basically take it from our own bank accounts and plow directly into the property, okay? Now, as we get more complex, which, like I said, we get in the investments course, then we start talking about deal structure, okay? Basically getting partners, doing joint ventures, talking about different sort of deal structures, tax strategies, that sort of thing. That is not the focus of this class. The focus of this class is strictly, okay, here's how much we're borrowing, here's how much we need in equity. Does that make sense? Okay, now, so in this particular instance, let's kind of go back here for a second. And this 484,951. Let's say that we come up with all of that money out of pocket. It's just cash money we pull out of our own savings and bank account. Everybody comfortable with that? Yes? Okay. Now, let's go back to okay. This number here, 19,615. Okay, we have already determined that our annual debt service is going to be the $65,385 million-ish loan, and then the rest is coming from equity. Yes. Okay, so this number, 19,615, the before-tax cash flow, technically, that is the amount of money we have in our back pocket on this deal after 1 year of operations, and that money can then do what? Be used to give a return to our equity. Does that make sense? So, for example, we can do a very basic calculation. You will hear it referred to as cash on cash, or as I tend to call it, before tax return on equity, okay? Which is as follows. Let's draw a little. Okay? Before tax return on equity. And that is simply going to be equal to your before tax cash flow divided by your equity. Okay? So in this case, your before tax cash flow is the 19,615. And our equity, what was that number?
484,951.
484,951. Okay? So let's just do the math there real quick. 19,615 divided by 484,951. So that gives us not really a great return of basically about 4.04% as a return on equity. Now, I would argue there probably are not very many, if any, equity investors that are going to be happy with a 4% rate of return. Okay? So chances are, based upon the current structuring of this deal, it's not going to work. You're having to put in way too much equity relative to the return that's being thrown off on the property. Does that make sense? Okay, so just because the property is cash flowing, and just because the lender's willing to lend you the money, doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea, it's a good investment. Because under these circumstances, you're going to put in way too much capital and you're not going to be getting enough of a return on that capital. Is everybody comfortable with that? Yes or no? Now, this is a very, very, very basic sort of analysis, and once again, the only reason I'm walking you through this kind of gives you what I would call kind of from beginning to end, okay? We're gonna go back through a lot of this, get into a lot more detail, that sort of thing, but this kind of gives you perspective of what this is all about, where this all sort of leads us, okay? Because at the end of the day, what we are most concerned with is, are we gonna be able to do this deal? Is it gonna be able to give us enough of a return? Are we gonna be able to pursue it? Yeah.
What would be the ideal return?
12%.
Totally depends on the investors. Because you could have, there are a lot of equity players out there that are saying, we're not even gonna look at it unless it's got a 15 or 20% rate of return. Okay? Other equity players are perfectly happy with 5 or 10%. It totally depends on their view of the market, you know, and it's a subjective thing. Okay? Okay? And it depends on whether you're dealing with individuals, you're dealing with institutional players, you're dealing with just super wealthy individuals. I mean, there's no absolute answer for that. Because, you know, whenever you go out and you're searching for equity, you're thinking about, okay, you know, where do you get that money from? You know, do you get it from high net worth individuals, which are people like sports stars, let's say, you know, that have got a lot of excess cash and they're looking for a place to park some money. Well, they may, you know, quite frankly, just simply say, we're not really overly concerned with the rate of return. We just simply want the safety and security of putting it into something that we feel comfortable with. And you may have an institutional investor that, you know, has a totally different perspective on things. So, and that's why that it's not, you know, one size doesn't fit all. Okay, question?
So with this kind of story that you just put on the screen, so we can get the conclusion that the $85,000 that you put up in the beginning is very low, because you're appraising at $1.5 million, right? According to what you did as appraisal. So if that's the case, you already know that you can increase the rent because the $85,000 is way too low.
Well, it may be the case that you can increase the rents.
Right?
It also depends on what were the assumptions the appraiser made. It may not be based on rents. It may be based on land value. See, we didn't even talk about that. That's a whole other element of this. That the value may not be derived at all from the rental income. It's derived from basically the underlying land value. And you know, here in Florida, I mean, you know, there are plenty of instances if you've got a property that is properly entitled, that maybe has a building that's not producing that much income on it, your best solution may be to do what? Buy the property, tear the building down, build a bigger building that generates more income.
From it, right? Per square feet.
You know, so we don't know the whole story is my point. You know, and so that's the sort of thing that, you know, you've got to kind of look at that. You know, where is that value being driven from? And we're going to get into that as well. You know, what percentage of the value is coming from the land? What percentage of the value is coming from the improvements on the land?
Yeah. How did he come up with 1.5?
Exactly. Which, like I said, we're going to get into that. Okay. All right. Everybody comfortable? Okay. Now, let's, in one sense, move backwards. Okay. So, what we're going to do now is get back to the calculator stuff. Okay. In terms of, now you've sort of seen a couple of little things that we can do with the calculator. So let's kind of bring you up to speed, those of you that are not familiar with how to use the calculator, kind of get you familiar with how to use the calculator, okay? All right, our good friend, the HP 10B. This calculator's been around since about 1987, okay, or versions of it. All right, it is probably the #1 simple, basic financial calculator out there. And, you know, as I think I've mentioned in the emails, you know, depending on where you buy it, you can probably pick it up as low as $20 and as much as 50, depending on, you know, once again, where you go to find it. The beauty of this calculator is it allows you to put in, you know, sort of basic sort of financial information about a property, get some solutions, be able to sort of do cash flows, be able to do amortization schedules, a whole number of things, all right there in your hand. Now, one of the things that is also available, there's an app for both the iPhone as well as the iPad for a simulator for the calculator. Now, one of the benefits of the simulator is that it will keep track of your keystrokes and will record them so that you can kind of look back and see what you may or may not have done wrong, okay? So as an example, to sort of show you, just where my fears of technology, hopefully everything works. Yes, no. Come on. Yay, we need Jesus. Okay, all right.
You want to do the shit out of it for a bit. You guys have a bad work while you're at it.
Okay, all right, well, what I was gonna show you, the simulator looks like this, okay? All right, and in essence, whatever you type here in the simulator, and will then automatically create like a ticker tape over here on the right-hand side. You can save it, you can actually send it via email, you know, you can cut and paste it, whole number of things. And so it's a great little tool if you want to sort of pick it up and potentially use it, okay?
What's the name of the app?
It's HP 10B.
Oh, okay.
Okay, now, all right, so let's do this. So, that is not apparently going to display up here correctly. I'm just going to kind of draw up some of the symbols here on the calculator. Going across the top row of the calculator. Okay, and then below this, okay, that's just the top row of your calculator. Everybody see that on their calculator? All right. So those are going to be the most commonly used, you know, buttons, if you will, on the calculator. Now, down the side of the calculator, I'm not going to write out every one of these. You've got an input key that we're going to be using, and then you're going to skip over. There's the K. We're not going to be using that, but right below that, we will be using the change sign key. And then right below that, you've got kind of a blue shift key. And then you've got the one that we use most commonly, which is the orange shift key that I always just kind of refer to as just a blackened box, okay? All right. Now let's just sort of go through and kind of explain a couple of these and kind of explain some of the financial logic and kind of a little bit of the math here. First of all, this course is not a math course. Virtually every single thing you do will be a numerical answer, but it's not a math course, okay? You don't actually have to add, subtract, divide, multiply, anything in your head. Everything is using a calculator, okay? So that means it is purely a logic course, okay? You have to understand the logic of what is being given to you and what you're being asked to solve for. It's as simple as that, okay? Everything else is punching buttons, okay? But understanding the logic of what you're being asked and what you're being asked to solve for is really important. And there are usually multiple steps, multiple ways that potentially you can get derailed in the process, okay? And so what I'm going to try to do is try to help you head off as many of those potential problems as possible and get you focused on, you know, how to do this as efficiently and as effectively as you can whenever going through and sort of solving these basic financial problems. Okay, so let's just start off with the keys across the top and kind of explain what they are, okay, and how we should think about them. The N key, that refers to the number of periods that you're going to be looking at for whatever problem it is. This could be number of years, could be number of months, could be number of days, could be, you know, a whole number of things, but it's the number of periods. And when I use that term very precisely because it does matter whether we're thinking about it in terms of number of years versus thinking about it in terms of number of months. Because, for example, if I tell you you have a 10-year loan, well, if it's an annual payment loan, your N is 10. But if it's a monthly loan, your N is 120 because it's 10 times 12 monthly payments, 120. Does that make sense? Okay? So in real estate, unlike traditional finance, we are probably only going to be looking at two different sort of types of loans or payment terms. We're going to be looking at monthly or we're going to be looking at annual, okay? So it's either going to be one payment per year or 12 payments per year. Now in traditional finance, you've got quarterly things, you've got, you know, semi-annual, bi-weekly, daily, you know, you've got all kinds of other sort of payment periods. But in traditional real estate, it's pretty much, it's either annual or it's monthly. Okay, so that's why we're going to focus on those two. All right? Now, moving over to the interest rate key. Interest per year. So, while this is the interest key, it can also be the rate of return. It could also be referred to as the yield. It could be referred to as a lot of different things, but ultimately it's the interest rate, okay? Now, in most cases, this is going to be, you know, what I say? Well, okay, calculate the rate of return for this investment. In many cases, you're going to be solving for the interest rate, unless you are solving for what we're going to be referring to later as the internal rate of return, which is different, okay? But the interest rate is simply, if you've got a loan, like a car loan or a home loan, normally that's the interest rate that you're given on that loan, okay? Very simple, okay? Moving on, present value. Normally, this is going to refer to the loan amount, at least in terms of real estate terms. So whenever we say the present value, normally we're referring to what is the loan amount for the property, okay? But it could also be what is just simply the value of whatever asset it is that we're looking at today, okay? That's the term present value, okay? PMT, payment. This is a fixed, keyword, fixed amount that we will either, and this is the key, we will either be receiving or paying. It can go both ways in the sense that, for example, if you're looking at a loan, the payment is being made by the borrower, yes? So under those circumstances, and we're going to talk about this, if you're making a payment as the borrower to the lender, that is a cash outflow from you as the borrower, meaning it's a negative to your bank account.
Credit.
Okay? Does that make sense? But if we flip that and we say we're looking at it from the lender's perspective, it's a positive payment. It's income. Does that make sense? So it becomes very important, and like I said, when we're working through the examples, you'll see what I'm talking about flipping the sign. And depending on whose perspective are you looking at it from, are you looking at it from the borrower's perspective? Are you looking at it from the lender's perspective? Are you looking at it from the landlord's perspective or the tenant's perspective? Because that's going to make a difference as to what sign potentially the payment has, and for that matter, the present value and the future value. Okay? Now the future value, most of the time that we use future value in real estate is we're searching for what is the balance on a loan at some future date. We're saying, okay, after 5 years, what is going to be the balance on this loan? If it's a 30-year amortization, we still have 25 years of payments left to make, but we want to know what the balance is at the end of year 5. Does that make sense? So that's going to be the future value. Now, future value also, in more traditional terms, when you're dealing with things like savings accounts or retirement accounts, you're saying, how much is going to be in my savings account or my retirement account at some future date if I make these deposits at this interest rate for this particular period of time, then you're going to be solving for future value. Does that make sense? Okay, so do all of those terms, at least conceptually, make sense in your mind? Okay, good. Now, let's do this. One of the things that I provide you in your chair was a set of sample problems, okay? And if you don't have one in your chair, it's because you sat in the wrong place. Okay. So what these problems do is they basically walk you through a number of the time value of money sort of features. And what we're going to do is we're going to run through a good number of these and walk you through the logic, walk you through the keystrokes, and then turn you loose on a couple of them to see if you can then obviously figure it out on your own. Does that make sense? Okay. And there is no quiz today, so you don't have to worry about, the quiz piece today. Next week, yes. Okay. So today you get to relax a little bit. All right. So let's do this. I'm going to kind of jump around on this a little bit and pick some that I think will be kind of interesting. Yeah, let's just start with A5. Okay. Peter Piper. Okay. Offered an investment that will pay $5,000 at the end of each year for the next 10 years, wants to earn an annual rate of return of 16%. How much is he willing to pay for the investment today? Okay, so the very first thing you should do with every single problem, regardless, is you need to figure out, is this annual, is this monthly, or in some cases, some of these problems, is it quarterly, bi-weekly, daily, whatever. And so the very first thing is, okay, is this asking about an annual situation or a monthly situation or something else? Based on the information it gives you.
In the next year, annual.
Annual. All the numbers are given to you annually. Okay? So the very first step on the calculator is you're going to set the calculator to 1 payment per year. Okay? So how do we do that? All right? You're going to simply hit the 1 key, and then you're going to hit the shift key that we talked about over here, that golden shift key, or orange shift key. And then underneath the payment key is payments per year. Okay? Now, what will happen, let's just do this together. 1 shift payment. Okay? Now, once you've done that, it should just have like 1 in the display. Okay? And now, if you hit shift, obviously we're going to be going a lot faster here in a minute. Hit the shift key, and then right below it, hit the clear key, but specifically you're accessing clear all. Okay? Hold that down. What should show in your display is 1P year. If it's showing up 1P year in your display, you've done everything right. Okay? Okay. Once again, all you do, once you turn the calculator on, type in 1 shift, payments per year, hit the shift, hit the clear all, hold it down, the clear all, and it should show up in your display 1P year, and that is simply telling you the calculator is currently set on annual compounding. Okay? Now, that's the sort of, those first 2 steps are the first thing you're pretty much going to put in on every single problem. You're going to put, now, it may be that some problems are monthly, so it would be 12 shift P year. Okay, and so we'll work through those and you'll get the hang of it here after a while. All right, so now let's just put in the information that the problem actually has. All right, so we'll just start off with the first number they give us, $5,000. All right, so what is this $5,000? He's offered an investment that will pay $5,000 at the end of each year. Okay, So what does that sound like to you? Payment. Okay, and is it income to him or is that an expense to him?
Income.
It's income. So it's just gonna be 5,000 payment. Okay, next piece of information, 10 years. Okay, 10. In this case, you could put it in as just simply 10 in, or you will find my own personal habit, which is a really great habit to get in, is to add a step. Shift in. Now, you're going to say, why do you do that? Okay. Underneath the in key is X payments per year. So what it's doing, whenever you type in 10 shift in, is it saying, okay, 10 times the number of payments per year, which happens to be 1, so it's 10. Okay, you're saying, well, why did you go to that extra step? Well, I go to that extra step because whenever you're dealing with monthly, it makes all the difference in the world. Okay? Because you'll see that as we start to do the monthly, because let's say that we have a 30-year loan that's monthly. You put in 30 in, as far as the calculator is concerned, that's 30 months. You put in 30 shift in, that's 360 months, which is what the actual term is. Does that make sense? Okay? So trust me, adding that little step there will save you, okay, in the long run. Okay, next piece, 16%. What's that? Interest rate. Okay? And then it's saying, how much will he be, or how much is he willing to pay for the investment today? So what does that sound like? So we're solving for present value, okay? So that's a setup. Now, the first question that you should be asking is, does it matter what order we put the 5,000, the 10, and the 16? No. What matters is that whatever we're solving for comes last. Because it has to have, obviously, that information above in order to do the solution. Okay, everybody cool with that? Yes, no, possibly could be. Okay, now, so let's put that in our calculators. This will tell me, once again, whether or not you can follow the directions.
Yeah, because if you put the negative in the payment, this is not a problem.
Okay, so you should get negative 24,166.14. Okay, if you did not get that, you did something wrong. Okay, now, what does that number represent? Okay, if you read the problem, that's how much that investment is worth to him today, in today's dollars, assuming a 16% interest rate. Now, one of the things I like to do, just to sort of visualize what's going on here, is draw what I would call a timeline. Okay, starting with your 0 and going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Okay, for 10 years. Okay, so what is actually taking place here? Right? He is receiving $5,000 a year. I'm not going to do this for every one. This is just to sort of give you the mindset of what to do. All right? So what's actually happening is he is receiving. Now there's a methodology to this. Everything that is above the line is considered to be a cash inflow, okay, or positive income. Everything below the line, whenever we're putting dollar amounts, are cash outflows or negatives, okay? Does that make sense? Now, let's just do some simple math to kind of wrap our brain around what's actually taking place. $5,000 a year for 10 years, simple math, 5,000 times 10 is a total of how much money? $50,000. Yes? So he is receiving hard cash currency of $50,000 over that 10-year period. So why then are we saying it's only worth $24,000 to him today?
Interest.
Because of the interest. Okay? He's getting a whopping
25,800.
16% interest rate, you know, on this particular investment. Most of us would love that, obviously, all right? So what that means is that he's willing to spend the $24,166.14 here at time period 0, right this minute, right now, and then his first cash flow payment will occur 1 year from today. Does that make sense? Because the assumption, if you read the question, and also we're going to talk about this a little bit, the assumption is the cash flows typically are going to occur at the end of the period or end of the year. Okay? Now, this is one of those sorts of things, and I hesitate to get into it right this minute, but I'm going to at least kind of get you thinking about it. Whenever you make a mortgage payment, you make a car payment, typically you make that payment when? Beginning of the month, yes?
Right.
When you make a lease payment, you typically make it beginning of the month. Okay. From an accounting perspective, whenever you typically are looking at real estate properties, you look at the accounting typically on an annual basis. And you typically look at the property as if everything is done and consolidated on December the 31st of the year. Because you sort of make the assumption that lease payments, while they may or may not have been made at the beginning of the month, they tend to get sort of accumulated, and then at the end of the year, you sort of lump everything together in one final number and as a sort of a lump sum. Well, and to a certain extent, that also happens during the month as well. That whenever you make your lease payment, your car payment, your mortgage payment at the beginning of the month, while the lender may receive it on the beginning of the month, they're going to typically spend a little bit of time processing that payment and then ultimately getting it, you know, completely reconciled within their accounts and so forth, so on. And the final posting, at least the way that we tend to think about it, maybe not completely reality, but the way we tend to think about it is the posting really doesn't fully occur until the end of the month. Okay? And the reason I'm saying this is because your calculator and Excel will allow you to make the choice as to whether or not a payment is made or received at the beginning of the period versus the end of the period. Beginning of